What if the real danger to Iran's government right now isn't falling from the sky at all, but rising up from its own mountains? Because while the world watches explosions light up Tehran night after night, something else has been quietly forming along Iran's western border, something almost nobody outside a handful of specialist reporters has actually noticed yet. Before we get into it, here's a quick favor to ask. If stories like this one, the ones that slip past the mainstream news cycle, matter to you, smash that subscribe button right now and send this video to one person who has absolutely no idea any of this is happening. This story deserves more eyes on it, and you can be the reason it gets them. For nearly half a century, one group of people inside Iran has been waiting for a moment exactly like this one, and it looks like that moment may have finally arrived. While American and Allied strikes have pounded Iranian territory night after night, something separate has been building quietly along the country's entire western frontier. Quietly, because this story has barely made a dent in mainstream coverage. We're talking about several major Iranian Kurdish opposition groups, organizations that have spent decades operating apart, sometimes even in open rivalry with each other, that have now come together under a single shared coalition for the very first time in their history. They are pressing toward Iran's border from the Zagros Mountains, from the highlands of West Azerbaijan province, from the ridgelines above towns like Piran Shah, Bane, and Pave. Multiple groups, one coalition, one shared goal, ending the grip of a government that has spent nearly 50 years suppressing, executing, and marginalizing the Kurdish people of Iran. Picture the geography for a moment. A jagged mountain range running along the entire western edge of Iran, spilling over into Iraq and Turkey, dotted with small towns most people outside the region could never place on a map. That range has, for generations, been both a prison and a refuge for Iranian Kurds. Hard enough terrain that the government in Tehran has never fully tamed it, but isolated enough that the rest of the world rarely thinks to look there when a bigger story is unfolding elsewhere. Right now, a bigger story is unfolding elsewhere, in the skies over Tehran, in the headlines about missiles and oil terminals. And that is exactly why almost nobody has noticed what has been quietly assembling in those mountains at the same time. And here's what makes this genuinely one of the most underreported threads of this entire war. A meaningful share of the American-led air campaign has landed directly inside Iran's Kurdish provinces. Cities like Kermanshah have absorbed some of the heaviest strikes of the entire war, second only to Tehran itself. Dozens of Revolutionary Guard security installations have reportedly been destroyed in and around Sanandaj alone in just the opening weeks of the conflict. So ask yourself a simple question. Who benefits the most when the Revolutionary Guard's grip over Kurdish territory finally starts to loosen? The answer is sitting right there in the Zagros Mountains, and the regime knows it. That's exactly why Iran has been striking Kurdish opposition. Camps across the border inside Iraq's Kurdistan region, with drones, missiles, and reportedly even harsher munitions. A government that feels genuinely threatened does not act rationally. It acts out of desperation. Before we break this down piece by piece, let's talk about who these Kurdish forces actually are, because most coverage treats this as one vague, faceless movement, when in reality it is several distinct organizations, each with its own long history, now operating under one unified command structure for the first time ever. If you had no idea a coalition like this even existed before clicking on this video, drop a comment below and tell me. This might genuinely be one of the most consequential developments happening in the entire region right now, and it is flying almost completely under the radar. Let's start from the beginning, because understanding exactly why this moment carries so much weight requires understanding how it actually came together. On February the 22nd, 2026, just 6 days before the United States and Israel launched their opening strikes against Iran, several of the most significant Iranian Kurdish opposition parties gathered together in Erbil, Iraq, and signed a formal charter of cooperation. That meeting produced what became known as the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan, an alliance bringing together groups that had historically operated with different ideologies, different command structures, and at times genuine rivalry, setting all of that aside to form a shared political and military front. This was not a symbolic press release timed for attention. It was the outcome of months of careful, difficult negotiation between parties that had never managed to fully unify in decades of trying before. And it went into effect just days before bombs started falling on Tehran. Let's walk through each of the major groups involved, because every one of them brings something different to this coalition, and understanding their individual histories helps explain why this alliance is genuinely significant. The first is the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, often known by its initials, the PDKI. This is the oldest and most established Iranian Kurdish opposition group in existence, with roots stretching back to before Iran's Islamic Revolution even happened. It is a democratic socialist party with a long and painful history. Its leaders assassinated over the decades, its fighters killed, its communities targeted again and again by the regime. Estimates place its armed wing somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 fighters, and its central goal has always been Kurdish self-determination within a federal or independent framework inside Iran. Think about what it means for an organization to survive that long under that kind of pressure. Entire generations of PDKI members have lived their whole lives never knowing a version of Iran that was not actively hunting them. Founders who were assassinated abroad in operations that stretched across multiple countries. Leaders replaced again and again as each one fell to bullets, bombs, or prison cells. And yet the party never disappeared. That kind of institutional endurance is rare, and it is part of why the PDKI still carries so much symbolic weight within this new coalition, even though younger, more combat-focused groups have since taken on a larger share of the actual fighting. What makes the PDKI particularly notable right now is reported direct contact between American officials and its leadership in the early days of this year's conflict, a level of engagement that would have been unthinkable not long ago, given that Tehran designated this group a terrorist organization decades earlier and has hunted its leaders across generations. That kind of engagement tells you something about the strategic value Washington appears to place on this Kurdish front, even if the full extent of that relationship remains genuinely unclear, and, according to some Kurdish officials themselves, has not translated into any formal support. The second major force is the Kurdistan Freedom Party, known as PAK. If the PDKI is the elder statesman of this coalition, PK is widely described as its most militarily assertive member. Led by Hussein Yazdanpana, PK has positioned itself as the most vocal and active combat arm within the coalition, maintaining bases west of Erbil and focusing its efforts on the corridor running toward Pave and Kermanshah. Many of its fighters were trained by American forces during the campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, meaning this is not a group starting from scratch. These are fighters with real combat experience, some direct exposure to modern combined arms tactics, and a demonstrated willingness to seek international attention and backing for their cause. PAK's own spokesperson confirmed in early March that positions between Erbil and Duhok had come under fire from ballistic missiles and drones, an early sign of just how seriously Iran was taking this group's activity, even before the broader conflict had fully unfolded. The third force is the Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK. This group carries what analysts have described as the most complicated regional baggage of the entire coalition because it is closely linked to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, operating primarily out of Turkey, a connection that makes Ankara distinctly uncomfortable. But from a purely military standpoint, PJAK's armed wing, known as the Eastern Kurdistan Units, is assessed by multiple analysts as one of the most capable fighting forces within the entire coalition. Notably, a significant number of its fighters are women. PJAK's forces operate out of the Kandil Mountains along the Iran-Iraq border, some of the most difficult terrain in the entire region. According to PJAK's own leadership, speaking earlier this year, the coalition currently has no formal relationship with either Washington or Jerusalem, an important detail that tempers some of the more dramatic framing you might see elsewhere. This is a coalition acting largely on its own initiative, not one operating under direct foreign command. The fourth group is the Organization of Iranian Kurdistan Struggle, known as Kabat. It is a smaller party within the coalition, but its inclusion matters because it broadens the political legitimacy of the alliance beyond just the 2 or 3 most recognizable names, representing an additional strand of the Kurdish nationalist movement and reinforcing that this coalition genuinely spans the ideological spectrum rather than being dominated by a single faction. And the fifth major component is Komala, which itself includes more than one branch, most notably Komala of the Toilers of Kurdistan and the Komala Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the latter joining the coalition a few days after its initial formation. Komala carries a distinct left-wing, secular identity and a long history of armed resistance against the Iranian government, stretching back to the years immediately following the 1979 revolution. Together, these groups represent, for the first time in modern Kurdish political history, a genuinely unified coalition, one that took months of careful, difficult negotiation to actually come together. Now let's talk about why this moment carries so much historical weight, because you cannot fully understand the significance of this coalition without understanding what Iranian Kurds have already lived through. Almost immediately after Iran's 1979 revolution succeeded, the country's new leadership moved to crush Kurdish autonomy demands by force, triggering a rebellion and establishing a pattern that has defined the relationship between Tehran and Iranian Kurds ever since. That pattern has been one of sustained, often brutal state pressure against a population whose central demand has simply been the right to speak their own language and govern their own affairs within their own communities. The PDKI was resisting this regime before most people currently active in this coalition were even born, Its leaders were assassinated. Its fighters were executed. Its communities absorbed decades of state violence. And every time international attention drifted elsewhere, the pressure would quietly intensify again. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting the same battle for nearly 50 years, while the rest of the world treats your struggle as a footnote. Generations of Iranian Kurds have grown up, grown old, and passed away without ever seeing the recognition or the change their parents and grandparents fought for. Children have been born into families where a grandfather was executed, a father was imprisoned, and an uncle disappeared entirely, simply for speaking openly about Kurdish identity or organizing a community gathering. That is not distant history. For many of the people involved in this coalition today, it is personal, immediate, and ongoing. The woman, life, freedom movement that erupted in 2022, sparked by the death in custody of a young Kurdish woman named Mahsa Amini, briefly brought the world's attention back to Iranian Kurdistan. The world watched, the regime responded with executions. And then, as it so often has, the world's attention moved on. Now, in 2026, with sustained American and Allied strikes hammering Iran from above, and a newly unified Kurdish coalition organizing along its western border, the people who have spent nearly 5 decades insisting this regime was never going to reform on its own are watching much of the rest of the world finally start to catch up to what they believed all along. Let's talk about the terrain itself, because the Zagros Mountains are not just scenery here. They represent a genuine strategic advantage for every group involved in this coalition. Iran's Kurdish majority provinces, spanning West Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, Kermanshah, and Elam, are home to an estimated 10 to 12 million Kurdish people, roughly 1 in every 10 Iranians. According to the Kurdistan Human Rights Network, the Iranian government killed at least 240 Kurdish citizens during the crackdown on protests earlier this year, with at least 2,000 more arrested. A scale of repression that helps explain why this coalition finally came together after decades of failed attempts at unity. Numbers like that are easy to read quickly and move past, but sit with them for a moment. 240 people killed and 2,000 more taken from their homes, their shops, their classrooms, simply for participating in protests demanding basic rights. Every one of those numbers represents a family that will carry that loss for the rest of their lives, a community that watched a neighbor disappear, a story that will get passed down to children who were not even born yet when it happened. That is the human weight sitting underneath every dry statistic in this story. This is not a fringe population operating on the margins of Iranian society. It is tens of millions of people who have lived under sustained state pressure for generations. And the mountainous terrain along the western border gives Kurdish fighters a genuine tactical advantage they have been drawing on for decades. These are fighters who grew up navigating this exact landscape, who know the ridgelines, the valleys, and the unofficial routes better than any outside force ever could. Many veterans of the anti-ISIS campaign in Syria and Iraq have brought real experience in modern combined arms tactics, drone warfare awareness, and coordinated operations back to this exact fight. The broader air campaign against Iran has, whether by strategic design or simple consequence, significantly weakened the regime's ability to maintain tight control over these Kurdish provinces. Strikes across cities like Sanandaj, Mahabad, Elam, and Kermanshah have targeted Revolutionary Guard barracks, intelligence facilities, and border security infrastructure. By some accounts, dozens of security installations had already been destroyed in Sanandaj alone within the opening weeks of the conflict. When you degrade a regime's command and control infrastructure in a specific region, you also degrade its ability to rapidly reinforce or respond to activity along that exact stretch of border. Here is where the strategic picture becomes genuinely interesting and worth sitting with carefully. Iran is trying to manage pressure on multiple fronts at once, absorbing sustained airstrikes while also facing growing activity along its western border, all while still working to suppress domestic unrest inside its own major cities. That is an enormous amount of pressure for any government to manage simultaneously. So what does a government under that kind of strain typically do? According to multiple reports, Iran has launched a substantial number of strikes into Iraq's Kurdistan region since the war began, a meaningful share of them specifically targeting Iranian Kurdish opposition groups and their positions. Iranian strikes have reportedly hit areas in and around Erbil directly. There have also been assassinations of Kurdish opposition figures on Iraqi soil, including reports of a PAK-affiliated member found dead in a hotel in Erbil in late June, with suspicion falling on Iranian intelligence operatives, though responsibility in that specific case has not been independently confirmed through neutral, verified sourcing. PAK has also publicly alleged, following a drone strike on one of its positions west of Erbil in mid-July that wounded several fighters, that the munitions used may have contained white phosphorus, and the group has formally called for an international investigation into the incident. I want to be careful here. because Iran has not confirmed the use of such munitions, and this remains an allegation from an interested party rather than something independently verified by neutral international observers. It is a serious claim worth taking seriously and watching closely, but it deserves the same caution any single source allegation in an active conflict requires. What we can say with more confidence is that the overall pattern, Iran repeatedly striking Kurdish opposition positions across the border in Iraq, attempting to assassinate opposition figures, and treating this coalition as a serious and growing threat, is consistent across multiple independent reports. That pattern itself tells you something meaningful about how seriously Tehran is taking this second front, regardless of exactly how each individual incident eventually gets verified. Before we go any further, I want to pause here for a second. If breaking down a story this layered, cross-referencing regional reporting, opposition statements, and independent analysis all at once is something you genuinely value, hit that subscribe button right now. This kind of coverage takes real time to piece together properly, and it only keeps happening with real engagement behind it. Let's talk honestly about what this coalition has and has not actually achieved so far, because you deserve the accurate picture here, not just the most dramatic possible framing. This alliance is real. It represents a genuine, historic step forward for a Kurdish political movement that has struggled with internal division for decades. But it is not yet a fully unified conventional fighting force capable of directly confronting the Iranian state on equal terms. These 5 or 6 groups still carry different ideologies, different external relationships, and historically different operational priorities. PJAC's connection to the PKK creates real friction with Turkey, a country nobody involved wants to see further destabilized. And the coalition's relationship with the United States remains genuinely ambiguous. According to PJAC's own leadership, there is currently no formal relationship with Washington or Jerusalem at all, despite some reporting suggesting informal contact and interest from American officials. That ambiguity mirrors a familiar and painful pattern in Kurdish history. More broadly, Kurdish forces that fought alongside American troops against ISIS in both Iraq and Syria have more than once felt abandoned once the strategic priorities of larger powers shifted elsewhere. That memory runs deep, and it is part of why this coalition's leadership appears to be moving carefully and deliberately rather than rushing into open, large-scale confrontation. Acting prematurely without reliable outside support could leave fighters exposed deep inside Iranian territory with no real backing if circumstances shift. But careful does not mean inactive. According to multiple reports, there have been a number of documented armed clashes inside Iran involving coalition-affiliated fighters over recent months, including incidents near border towns and highland areas in West Azerbaijan and Kurdistan provinces. Tracked casualty figures for this specific crisis show losses on the Kurdish side during the broader war period have included several fighters killed in direct clashes with Iranian forces, alongside a small number of additional losses connected to earlier protest-related violence. These numbers remain modest compared to the scale of the broader war, and it is worth being upfront about that rather than inflating them. This is a real, active, but still developing front, not yet a large-scale conventional military campaign. Iran, for its part, has continued its long-standing pattern of internal suppression, even amid all of this external pressure. Reports indicate the regime has carried out executions connected to earlier rounds of protest, alongside continued arrests and heavy security operations across Kurdish cities. That pattern, suppress, arrest, and occasionally execute, has defined the regime's approach to Kurdish unrest for nearly 5 decades, and it appears to be continuing even as the government simultaneously manages pressure from the skies above and a newly organized opposition along its western edge. Let's zoom out and think about the broader strategic picture here, because this is genuinely where things get interesting. Iran is currently trying to manage several serious pressures at once: sustained strikes from the air, continued unrest and underlying discontent inside its own major cities, and now a newly unified opposition. Movement operating along a mountainous western border that has historically been extremely difficult for any government to fully control. Some of the country's most significant missile and drone infrastructure happens to be located in or near these same Kurdish provinces, which is part of why so much of the broader air campaign is concentrated in this exact region, whether specifically targeting Kurdish opposition corridors or simply targeting military infrastructure that happens to sit there. When border security, infrastructure, and regional command posts get degraded through sustained strikes, the practical effect is that the government's ability to tightly control movement along that border weakens too. That is not a coincidence worth dismissing, even if it is difficult to say with certainty how deliberately coordinated it actually is between the air campaign and the Kurdish coalition's own independent activity. If this video is helping you actually piece together a story most outlets have completely missed, share it with someone who has no idea. A unified Kurdish coalition is even operating along Iran's western border right now, Stories like this one live or die on word of mouth, and you tapping share genuinely changes who gets to see it next. So what would a genuinely significant outcome from this Kurdish front actually look like? It is worth being realistic here. Nobody serious is suggesting a Kurdish march on Tehran itself. The far more plausible and strategically meaningful outcome would be the coalition establishing and holding even a small liberated area within Kurdish majority territory, somewhere. The regime struggles to retake, specifically because any attempt to mass forces for a counterattack risks exposing those forces to the ongoing air campaign overhead. Even a modest, sustained liberated zone would carry enormous symbolic weight far beyond its physical size. It would demonstrate to the wider Iranian population, not just Kurds, but every other marginalized group inside the country, that this government's control is not actually as absolute or unbreakable as it has spent nearly 5 decades insisting it is. That kind of psychological shift, more than any single military engagement, is often what actually erodes an authoritarian government's grip over time. History offers plenty of examples of exactly this pattern. Authoritarian governments rarely collapse because of one decisive battle. They erode slowly as the population stops believing the government's own story about its own strength, one small crack at a time, until enough cracks appear that the whole structure can no longer hold its own weight. A sustained Kurdish-held pocket of territory, even a small one, would function less as a military victory and more as visible proof that the crack is real, not just something whispered about in private conversations, but something anyone with a phone and an internet connection could actually see for themselves. There is also a meaningful distinction worth drawing here between economic pressure and this specific kind of pressure. Much of the broader conversation about squeezing Iran economically has focused on things like its oil export infrastructure, understandably so, given how central that revenue is to the regime's ability to function. But what is happening along the Kurdish border represents a different kind of pressure entirely, one centered on legitimacy rather than revenue. Every image of sustained Kurdish activity inside Iranian territory, every report of the regime being unable to fully suppress this front, despite dedicating real resources toward doing exactly that, chips away at the broader narrative the Iranian government has spent decades building about its own permanence and control. So here's what I genuinely want to know from you. Do you think this Kurdish coalition has the potential to become a truly decisive factor in how this broader crisis eventually plays out? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I think this is exactly the kind of question where informed public discussion actually matters, especially for a story this underreported. Let's also be honest about something that deserves more attention than it is currently getting. This regime has responded to internal unrest with suppression and violence for nearly its entire existence, and there is no clear sign that pattern is changing now, even under this level of external and internal pressure. Reports of continued arrests, executions connected to earlier protest movements, and heavy security operations across Kurdish cities have continued throughout this period. That response, suppress first, ask questions never, has been the government's playbook in Kurdish areas since 1979, and it has largely worked for most of that time because Kurdish opposition forces never had this level of unified coordination, and there was never simultaneous external military pressure degrading the regime's ability to respond at the same time. Both of those things are now true simultaneously, and that combination is genuinely new. Whether it proves decisive is still an open question, but it represents a meaningfully different situation than anything Iranian Kurds have faced in living memory. The people actually fighting on this specific front are not doing it for headlines or international attention. They are fighting for the ability to speak their own language freely in their own schools, for the ability to organize a community meeting without fear of arrest, for a future where their political leaders are not assassinated on foreign soil by intelligence operatives from a government hundreds of miles away. Real people carrying a decades-old grievance against a government that has offered them very little beyond suppression, and at times, outright violence. And it is worth remembering that even while managing strikes from the air, ongoing unrest in its own cities, and now organized pressure along its western border, Iran's government has continued directing real resources toward internal suppression. That is not incidental. It is arguably the core of how this system has maintained control for nearly 5 decades. The moment that internal suppression genuinely loosens, even briefly, the population tends to move. And the regime knows this better than anyone, because it has watched it happen before, in 2022, and again more recently. So even as sustained strikes continue overhead, and Kurdish fighters organize along mountain corridors below, the government keeps reinforcing the message that it still holds the guns and therefore still holds control. But that message becomes considerably less convincing when the people receiving it are simultaneously watching military infrastructure get struck night after night, and watching a coalition their government spent decades trying to prevent from ever forming finally come together anyway. Here is the honest picture I want to leave you with. This Kurdish coalition is real. It is active. It represents a genuinely historic moment in Kurdish political organizing, and Iran is clearly taking it seriously enough to dedicate real military resources toward disrupting it, including strikes across the border and, according to opposition sources, potentially far more severe measures as well. But it is not yet, on its own, the single decisive factor that determines how this broader crisis resolves. It has real potential to become significant if the broader pressure campaign against Iran continues, and if this coalition can translate scattered border activity into something more sustained and territorially meaningful over time. Whether that actually happens depends on factors well beyond what any single video or any single coalition can fully predict right now. If you made it this far, that tells me you are someone who actually wants to understand what is happening beneath the surface of this war, not just the headline version of it. And I genuinely think this story deserves far more attention than it is currently getting. There is a broader lesson sitting inside this story too, one worth carrying with you well beyond this specific conflict. Movements built on decades of shared grievance rarely announce themselves with a single dramatic headline. They build slowly, quietly, through failed attempts and painful setbacks, until one day the pieces that never quite fit together before finally do. Think about how many times in the past this exact coalition could have formed and did not. Different decades, different leaders, different moments of regional upheaval that might have created the conditions for unity. And every single time, old rivalries, competing ideologies, or simple mistrust kept these groups apart. What makes this moment different is not that the grievance suddenly became worse. The grievance has been constant for nearly 50 years. What changed is that enough external pressure finally arrived at the same time. Enough internal exhaustion with division finally set in, and the door that had stayed shut for decades finally opened just wide enough for these parties to walk through it together. What is happening in the Zagros Mountains right now is not a footnote to this war. It might genuinely be one of its most consequential threads, unfolding largely outside the world's attention, carried forward by people who have been telling anyone willing to listen for nearly 5 decades that this moment was always going to come eventually. And if it does come, fully and undeniably, it will not have started with a single headline either. It will have started exactly the way it started this time, quietly in the mountains, long before most of the world thought to look there. Thank you for watching this all the way through, and I will see you in the next one.